And if you're thinking about what's the bare minimum I have to do, you're thinking at it the wrong way. You've got to think about what's the safest position for the client, but still being as economical for them and you as possible.
Hello, it's Jacob Hill with GRC Academy. Today I'm here with Mr. Bobby Guerra and Miss Kaleigh Floyd from Axiom. How are y'all doing today?
Doing great.
Awesome.
Good. Thank you so much for coming on. And folks, if you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to like, comment, share, subscribe, review, all those great things. Helps me out. Thanks in advance. Bobby, Kaleigh, tell us about yourself. How did you get to where you are today?
We're an MSP in Jacksonville, Florida. So we started back in 2002. The employer I was working at was going through a recession. So 2002. So those of you who may not remember, if you rewind, there was a .com bubble burst right around 2000, right? That really racked the company that we were working for. And they kind of went into a tailspin and started doing, some layoffs and things. And so then I was like, I think I'm going to go off on my own. So I started my own MSP and hadn't looked back since.
Well, mine's a little bit different. Bobby is my dad. And so when he started his business in 2002, I happened to be a part or along for that ride. And then when I turned 17, I started working for the company and I haven't stopped since. I've had a couple different hats. So I know a bit about IT in a couple different ways, but right now my hat is the marketing director for Axiom. And I also am the producer of our podcast, Climbing Mount CMMC. So,
and she does a lot of the sales piece of it as well for us.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you so much for coming on. Really exciting time for you all. Just coming through your CMMC Level 2 certification assessment. That's amazing. And folks, wait for that. That's at the end. So make sure you watch the whole thing and get that part. That's going to be awesome hearing your experience. So looking forward to that. Tell us about how you got there and when did you actually start on this and, how much did it cost? All of those things.
Oh, wow. Boy, that's a lot to unpack. Yeah. We started the journey, I think, out of ignorance would be a clear way of putting it. We didn't know what we didn't know. This is 3 or 4 years ago when we started doing it. And there was a lot less clarity about what a managed service provider would be able to do, whether they have to be certified or not, what kind of costs would be involved, what experience did you need to have? And I was thinking to myself, I love providing managed services. That's what I do. That's the lane I swim in. That's all we do. We're not a C3PO. We don't do any of these other things. We're a managed service provider through and through. That's all we've done. And that's what we love to do. So I'm I think we could do this in the CMMC space, and we get to support the warfighter. We get to support our country. I thought all of that was just something fascinating and I wanted to be involved in it. So then I just started moving into that direction and then, got certified CCP. I went to Edwards and got training there. And then I happened to run into Joy, who just was this fire hose of knowledge just pouring into my brain. And I got to meet, Chris,
Amira Armand,
Chris Silvers, Brian Hubbard, Matt Hoper. All these just really just smart, genius people that have helped pour into us that, we're here today being level 2 certified because of those individuals that helped us keep stepping forward. It's been a huge journey and something that, when we got certified and we kind of did the closeout on that Thursday, I cried a little bit, just because of all of the hard work and effort to go into our team and sacrifices and blood, sweat, and tears to be able to get it done. It is literally the hardest business challenge that I have ever taken over by far. There's nothing close.
So we started how long would you say? This year will be 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And when I first made the first marketing document that he was we're going to have to prepare everything for the CMMC thing. There was 5 levels on that document of CMMC. And then I had to redact that because then they changed it to 3. Right. But there's definitely been some evolving over those few years.
And that's so good point, Kaleigh, because there was nobody to turn to for MSPs in a peer group. MSPs are managed service providers. We typically have peer groups that we work with, and they'll tell you what the average service cost is for a user to support, right? So 0.3 hours per month is the average time that a person is going to take up of an engineer. I didn't know if you knew that or not, but that's a statistical kind of like pie thing. And there's lots of things like that sort of work out in the MSP industry. Those numbers don't exist for the CMMC ecosystem as an MSP support net. So it's like all new math about how you step into that space to start trying to understand it.
Yeah.
And it's that way for the marketing. There wasn't like a marketing playbook that, so I just kind of turned to Kaleigh and said, well, honey, like, good luck. Like, we need to try to do this marketing thing and figure it out. And boy, did she deliver, a lot of learning.
Well, how much money did you allocate?
For going level 2? $250,000.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we haven't spent it all, but we're getting there. Yeah. So we assume that over the course of 2 years. And I would say we probably have met that over the course of 2 years and will exceed it beyond, just because of there's employee staffing. There's, like Adam, we've had him here full time. That's all he's done is really focusing on CMMC documentation. I focused on the architecture design. I mean, we both worked on it together, but like when we went the splitting of duties, like I went that way and he went that way. And then we just went hammer down on trying to get it done. And then I went to Kaleigh and I'm like, honey, like we got to start grassroots programs. We need to start letting people know that we're serious about this. We're stepping in the space, what this looks like, start making introductions, start getting to know people. How do we do this? And she just went on her way to do that too. And all that costs money. You got the licensing from Microsoft and buying templates and legal fees for attorneys to help you build your agreements and all this stuff. I mean, it gets crazy expensive, very, very fast. And you really have to think about that. If you're going to step into that space, you really should block out time and money is the number 2 things that you need to block out. If you're not blocking out the money to spend and the time to make good use of that money, you're going in a bad direction. I'll just sort of rat on my industry a little bit. Like you'll have people that want to participate and let me just be fully transparent. I've gone through all of these phases. Okay. Yeah. Because I learned the hard way, but I've now come to the realization, I've got to be all in. You've got to fully commit to this to really be in it, to win it for the client. And so, but, I wanted to first try to approach it just like I had everything else. And you can't do that. You can't sort of barely try to participate in the audit. You can't sort of do some of these pieces. You've got to think about, okay, well, what tools can I use? Right? Okay, well, those got to go. All right, well, then how am I going to do what I need to do? Okay, well, now I need to think about a whole new process and tool set and activities. And okay, well, now I've got people. Those people don't know how to do that because they've always been doing it the other way. So now I've got to think about how I'm going to train my team to do other activities in a compliant fashion. But I don't want to teach my whole team to be, CMMC geniuses. So I've got to build a system that they can follow that makes sense for them, that still supports the client's journey. So it's just, as you start to go, you start to see that your mind changes as an MSP. It's not from how can I just barely step my toe in to like, how can I do this the absolute best? And then it's like, okay, well, now it's not about me. It's about the client. So now I have to not only pass myself, but I have to pass in a way that I can help my client pass that I might not have even met yet. So you've got to really start thinking along those lines, and you start to see that, MSPs, as they come in this space, they sort of have to walk that journey and start learning, as you start kind of reaching the end of the destination. It's kind of funny. Like when I was getting ready for the audit, like my forehead started breaking out in like dots I'd never seen before. I was like, what do I stick my head in like poison ivy or something? Like I wasn't getting sleep. Like trying to get ready for our audit, like me and Adam were just like, we were really focused. But after I passed, you'd think I would sleep like a baby. And I sort of did. I woke up crying every night. No, I'm just kidding. I wasn't crying. But I did wake up at 1. And the first thing I was thinking is I went and sat on my couch and I looked at the television, which was not on. And from 1 a.m. to like 4 a.m. And what I was thinking about the whole time was how can I learn the lessons from what I just learned that week and apply that to the best to my clients so that when it's time for them to pass, I don't want them to have to go through what I went through as much as possible. Like, how do I get that there for them? Because they got a job to do. My job is to do the stuff to try to help get them there. So how can I get them there the best and set them up for the best chance for success? Because they're going to build a part. They're going to have a drone. They're going to do whatever that is. And they don't have to think about this other stuff if they can help it. So we've got to set up a system for them to do it the right way naturally. And that is not easy. That is super hard to do.
It sounds like a huge challenge. And MSPs also have an additional challenge beyond that of a defense contractor. The CMMC assessment process was updated. Maybe it's been a month and a half. The CMMC news cycle has been very, very fast recently. But in any case, in there, it says that if you have an external service provider, which includes cloud service providers, but also IT managed service providers or even security, MSSPs, if they're supporting your CMMC and scope systems, they have to provide what's called a customer responsibility matrix that outlines the shared responsibility between them and then the clients. It's a CMMC phase 1 check. And that's just when they're checking readiness for the CMMC assessment. If that CRM is not available, it's a no-go. So it's so critical that the MSPs out there actually have that document and have it all outlined as it needs to be. So let's talk about that.
Some MSPs don't really believe in that way. They do the marriage counseling approach for CMMC. So they take their first few clients of that need to get CMMC Level 2 certified and walk down it with them. They're doing it at the same time. But we were like, no way in heck can we do that. Like we have to have these things put in place. We have to have templates. We have to have things that speak to each other to make it easier for our clients when we onboard them. So Bobby and Adam spent a crazy amount of time and effort and brain power and loss of sleep, to be able to think about how we can create an SSP, a system security plan for our clients that talks back to ours, and how we can create a template that is scalable to where when we are having clients and onboarding clients, that it's possible to do it in an effective and efficient manner. And then just like how you were saying, we have to have a customer client responsibility matrix that is in the middle of those that talks to specifically what we do and what our clients do. And that is, that's no small mountain to climb. And that's not required for, like how you said, the contractors that are doing this in this space that are going for level 2, they only have to think about themselves, their company, their SSP, but we were doing kind of 2 mountains at the same time. So quite difficult.
Yeah, you've got those 2 pieces, the system security plan and the matrix. It's kind of like the Oreo, right? So you've got your SSP that's the managed service provider. You've got the matrix in the middle, not the movie, but
is double
shared,
stuff.
Yeah,
is a
the
double
shared
stuff
responsibility. and the shared responsibility needs to split into at least 3 categories. It's the MSP's job. It's our job together with you and the client. And then there's the client's responsibility. But in the middle one, there's actually a little bit of a hybrid of 2 there. In our opinion, in that shared piece, a lot of it needs to be the policies and procedures that the MSP has given that the client needs it for them to inherit and start working on, so that your SSP and theirs are native. They're like the same family and talking together, because if an MSP wants to try to scale, they need to have a system that's going to afford that capability. You want to have an MSP that's going to be there to support you, not just, have 1 or 2 clients in the space and then say this isn't good for them and dip. You want to have someone that's going to really seriously commit to being into this space. And we absolutely want to do that. So we created the systems, our SSP, then the matrix, and then the SSP that the client's going to have, and all their policies and procedures, which are brothers and sisters to kind of how we operate, so that they call back and work as a team together. And what that does is it provides more confidence that what they're going to have, they're going to pass because we passed. They're using what we've had. So it's a baseline off of what we have. And then additionally, because the system, like in our SSP, we have what our inheritance is from our third party like Microsoft. And then also at that, in each assessment objective, we have also how we're going to support our clients. So we're calling back to them directly from our SSP. And then in their SSP, we say, here's our stuff. But they have a beginning inheritance statement that says, oh, we're using Axiom for these activities and things. And then the matrix does a more detailed dive between those two. So, and then we have to have our agreement that we sign with the client that legally binds us to those responsibilities, because in the scoping guide, it asks you to do that. And so we have all of that. And, we went to Curie Systems and got our templates from them to start from, but they didn't have that MSP design. Like we had to, it was designed for just a small business doing it themselves. And we sort of hot rodded it and built it off of that and then evolved it into this larger scale thing. And yeah, it was quite the task.
I'm sure. So let's talk about maybe a little bit of detail there. What's maybe your favorite control when you talk about shared responsibility?
I would say 3.1. And the reason why I would say 3.1.1, and it's funny you mentioned that. We actually had a little bit of banter on LinkedIn about this. Like in my opinion, and actually interesting, in the PI training course 3.1.1, when they go to teach you that, the Cyber AB's training talks about how, and their belief is that you need to have a separation of the approval process that's a form that they fill out or something that they go through, and then they get added to their intra or their Active Directory database. But a lot of times people, what they'll do is they'll just say, my whole process is just adding them into AD. Like, someone just needs to be added. AD is my, 3.1.1. And you can't do that. Like, you've got to have some form. There has to be an approval process. And that all sort of walks through 3.1.1. But the thing with managed service providers is like A, B, and C, so Alpha, Bravo, Charlie of 3.1.1 will typically be the client. So they're going to fill out the form. So they're going to authorize the user. And then they're going to go through the approval process. And then they're going to kick it to the MSP, who's then going to implement that. So now they're going to add it to intra. They're going to make sure that they only have the rights they need to. So that's 3.1 is I think a perfect example of how the MSP and the client have to work together in order for that. And it's interesting when it comes time for the client's audit to happen, how that can work out, right? So the audit, in my opinion, should be Alpha, Bravo, Charlie. They're talking to the client. When it gets to, Delta, the followings, and that, they're going to inherit from our level 2, and they just have to verify that they're in AD, for example, correctly, or intra, or whatever. And that's all new math, because that's not clearly defined in 32 CFR, how that works, right? But there's verbiage in 32 CFR that accounts for that to somehow happen. It just isn't clearly defined. But that's where, like, I want to go on the offensive and start trying to define this. And that's a big passion of ours too. Right.
So from the basic standpoint, shared responsibility for 3.1.1, authorized access control, the user or the company that your client would request, through some sort of request fulfillment process or change process or something, would submit that request to create the user. And then you would create that user on their behalf with the access permissions and metadata and all that stuff. That's a great example. And that's really clear. What's another one that might be not as clear, but is extremely important to document the responsibility?
I think another one is like remote access. External systems is another one that's really a big one, because you think external systems, what you're thinking is you have to know what systems the client needs to have that they might be storing outside data that you as the MSP may not even have total control of. But their CUI or some type of those data might sit there. And so you need to understand, and that's part of that conversation you need to have with them to have a better understanding. FIPS is also can be such a challenge. But then I think sometimes the concern as a managed service provider, they hire you and you come in and there's only certain amounts of controls you can do. You can't do it all. I can't go to their location and do their visitor log archiving. They have to do that, right? So those are challenges where you have to provide training to the client so that they can then do their job
awareness training.
So it's like, how is an MSP that you can come alongside them? It's not your necessarily your responsibility, but how can you coach them and provide the best chance of success for them, even though it's not truly your responsibility? Like, that's a challenge.
Yes. I think a key when that CRM comes into play, because a lot of people, they might hire an MSP like, I'm good, I don't need to do anything. But that CRM is outlining exactly what their responsibilities are. I think that's so important.
And it's just, even in the sales process, you have to be super careful as you're talking with them. You're like, look, I can't guarantee you're going to pass. I'm promising the opposite, that, what I guarantee is that you're going to get our experience and we're going to give you the best shot, but you're going to have to do some of this. You're going to have to be involved. You're going to have people that are going to spend time, and you're going to have to spend money, and none of the C's for CMMC stand for cheap. So it's going to be expensive. They've got to sign up for that. And not everybody has gone through all the levels of CMMC grief and kind of come to that realization, like, this is what we need to do. We're all in, let's go get it done. So as we're going through the sales process, we're typically sensing, like, we're trying to feel out the client and where they're at in their journey. Are they ready to go? If they're like, we're just sort of getting some quotes, we're trying to get an idea, and that's all well, and we will be very transparent and try to share it. But we only want to onboard clients and work with them that want to move down that path. Like, once they start, we want to make sure that they finish, because you've got money that's going to be exchanged. You've got legal requirements of timeframes that have to get done. Like, it could unwind and get really ugly. So you want to make sure you're bringing on people that really understand what is involved, and they're willing to accept the responsibilities that are there on their side to get done, because you're really this is probably the most intimate, like, relationship with a client. That compliance level, CMMC requires that connectivity between the two of you, and you've got to be on the same page.
You think about that ideal client, you hear that talked about a lot. And so for you want to succeed for them, but because of that shared responsibility, they have to be on board too. So that's very interesting as well.
And we've walked away from some pretty good deals that people are like, oh, we have this. And after I look at their leadership or look at how things are going, I'm like, this isn't going to be a good fit for us. I'm sorry. We're going to have to say no on this.
I would say this is a way different world than what we came from, because I do the security training internally for our clients that we offer, because we offer that throughout the year for our clients, and it is pulling teeth to get some of our clients to get there. But it's like, well, I don't know if you've noticed this, but one of the controls in CMMC does require you to have this. So those kind of clients that we have are a little bit different than the commercial ones that we were used to in the past. And that has also been a really interesting change of events internally too.
Training is such a one that's a team effort, right? We have agreements that we have templated that they sign that is for their staff that do things like administrative permissions or authorization for access to the system, other things like if they have BYOD, there's all kinds of agreements that they have that they can exercise with their clients when they're allowing them access to different things that they can sign. And that's to some extent training, because you have in there what you're doing, but you need to layer on top of it like insider threat and other types of additional, CUI training on a regular basis, and those types of things of how to handle it. All of those things need to happen. And those aren't optional. Like, you're not like, I don't think we're going to attend. Like, no, like you all have to do them. Like, no matter who you are, if you have access to the system, you've got to go through the policies that have their outlined and do the training that's required. And so that's just an example of where the client has to participate and they can't phone it in. Because it's not something to dodge. Can you imagine if you brought on a client, you got them to level 2, and let's say they passed, and then as you're working with them, you start perceiving that they're doing everything purposely wrong.
Oh no.
Like, what do you do about that? Right?
Yeah.
Those policies are there for a reason. And, as an MSP, you're on the hook for supporting that client to do the things that are required. And if you're a participant in that they have contracts, like they can get really hairy. So that's why you really, really need to make sure that the people you're engaging with as a managed service provider are in it for the right reasons and that they're there to make sure that they fulfill the obligations of the contract in the way that they're obligated to by CMMC and the NIST 800-171 controls.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we don't have a ton of variance about those types of things. We have to abide by that. So we have to make sure that as we're working with those clients, that's how it's going to be as well.
Yeah.
Well, let's go further. Okay. So let's talk some theory. I love this conversation. So let's talk some theory. All right. So, I mean, you've got a ton of experience, Jacob. So let's just put your auditor hat on for just a second. So let's say that you're in phase one and you're in the process of talking with the client, right? And you know that they're engaging with the managed service provider.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, you know, it calls that in the scoping guide that they have to bring their matrix.
Mm-hmm.
And they also have to have their agreement that clearly states that they have to do what they say they're supposed to do. So those two things is specifically called out.
Yes.
But do you think that the managed service provider, it would be okay if they showed up without any SSP, any policy, any procedure? How would you feel about that?
Yeah, I would say you better come back or get a new MSP, you know, because how are you?
Would you let them proceed? Would you let them get past phase one? I think that would be.
Yeah. Would you even let them get past, or would you say no?
No,
Yeah.
you couldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, you couldn't. But if you think about it, they're not technically required to be level 2. So, but that's why having an MSP that is level 2, you know that they have that, right?
Yeah.
You know that they're going to have that system security plan. You know that they're going to have their policy and procedure. And by the way, they need to make sure when they're engaging with the client that they have their matrix. And their matrix is supposed to be kind of the Rosetta Stone that connects the dots between you and the client. But I think, in my opinion, I think a good MSP should go further. They should have the policies and the procedures in their system calling appropriately back to the client. And they need to have more than just the matrix talking about the connectivity between the two. You can do that. That's the minimum bar. But I think more needs to be involved. I think you need to have that because it starts to make things even more interesting about that inheritance situation. Because if you're able to include that in your system security plan, you're able to add some more things that it starts to get more interesting about how a client might not have to have as much assessed because of the MSP already has a well-defined process about that. And they have it in their SSP and their matrix. Because in that matrix, it can't be just, you know, partial, whatever. You need to have like words in there that speak about what those activities are, both for the client and for you.
Let's dive into compliant tools then. As an MSP,
Boy.
what kind of challenges have you faced there?
Not everybody's the same as me. Like you take somebody like Andy Sauer, who kind of grew up in the gov space, right? I didn't. I came from the traditional MSP space, you know, so I didn't have some of those advantages of people that have had that experience in some of those. And I wouldn't categorize the challenges that Andy had with, say, advantages, but he at least had more experience from a compliance perspective than I did as I stepped into this space. But him and like Scott Edwards and the people from Sub 7, they all stepped in way sooner than we did. And it was way more in its infancy and way more difficult of a journey for them to kind of go through.
Yep.
But when we came in, like we started to realize that the tool sets that we had weren't going to work. And we realized that there's a bit of a gamemanship from the perspective of you've got to make sure that you set the client on the most foundational, safe position. It may not be the most cost-effective position. It may not be the most easy to manage position, but you've got to set them up for the best position to pass. So you could use some tools that could be called into question, and maybe they're not giving you necessarily all the access right information. You go to talk to them and they give you the runaround about getting access to their, you know, compliance stances on things. You know, it's just, do you want to fight that fight, or do you want to start utilizing tools and things that you know are going to have the best chance for the client to pass? And that's sort of what we looked at. So then we're like, well, then that means we're going to have to try to use most of the Microsoft stack if we can help it, right? But then we think, well, okay, well, we love Screen Connect. How could we use Screen Connect in their environment, but Screen Connect isn't FIPS? So how could we do that? So then, you know, what you start doing is you start putting these challenges in front of you and you start thinking to yourself, how do I solve them in a way that doesn't jeopardize the client's, fashion? And then we think, Well, we can utilize a zero trust architecture that wraps it in a FIPS validated module. Okay, that's cool. How do we do that? Like, how it's one question after the other as you're working through the tools. And then, over questions of months and testing and setting up things and labs and trying different things, that, you start building those tool sets that you're going to realize are going to work. What tools do I need to host? Because you got I think I called it the four big, the big four, but I think Ryan Bonner's term is better. He calls them the four horsemen of the apocalypse. When it comes to CMMC, you've got your patching, number one, vulnerability, number two, application allow listing, number three, and your AV. So the four horsemen, how are you going to do that? And how are you going to offer that to the client in a scalable fashion? And it's got to be a way that doesn't jeopardize their compliance. So it's got to have all of that wrapping in it. And if you're thinking about, well, what's the bare minimum I have to do? You're thinking at it the wrong way. You've got to think about what's the safest position for the client, but still being as economical for them and you as possible. And that's the path that we took. So it sort of defined what we had to host ourselves, what we were able to leverage from Microsoft. And then you start thinking about, well, what if none of those work? What's acceptable? And we kind of drew the line at FedRAMP. If it's going to be a cloud solution, we're just going to stick with FedRAMP for now. And so once we kind of define that sort of let us know the pieces on the table. And then, at that point, then you're just figuring out the best strategy to play the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's a very different mindset, I think, from traditional IT, because I started in IT and I know sometimes you're just hands on keyboard, type in. All right, we fixed the problem. Excellent. Right. Let's move on. And you update your ticket, solved. No documentation, no nothing. But this is very different because you almost got to start from compliance first.
Yes.
And it's limiting. It's very limiting.
You're right. Mm-hmm. It's true. It's like, what tools are acceptable in the gentleman's joust? Well, that's not appropriate. So we're going to have to set that aside. We can only, pistols or whatever, there's only things that are acceptable in the fight based on the controls, around NIST and things like that. And so you've got to understand those. And that puts a lot of pressure on someone that may not know CMMC coming in off the break. So you have to then start getting your knowledge level skilled up. When I came in, I didn't know hardly anything. So the first company I went to start engaging learning was I went to just get my CCP through Edwards. And then I think I probably asked, no joke, 80 questions.
I'm sure.
Those people knew who I was, that's for sure. I think some hated me or loved me or whatever, but they knew who I was because it was so informative. And then just kept pushing my knowledge and just working with people that were such kind-hearted, giving, knowledgeable people that saw that we really wanted to do the right thing and they wanted to help us get there.
I do want to point out, though, something that I think was interesting, and Jacob, you made me actually think about this when Bobby was talking, which was that Adam Evans and Bobby are the most knowledgeable on our staff with CMMC. But for an MSP, we have technicians that are underneath that are doing these support tickets for our clients, right? Do all of them have to now go through their CCP and get certified? Is that what you're saying? No, because if you look, if you actually create your SSP and you look at each individual control, it is not all CMMC speak. They're logical security steps that a technician can accomplish when given the correct, parameters and direction. And so the difficult part as an MSP is for Bobby and for Adam to create those parameters, as well as Jackie, our project manager, who is able to really implement those things in a well-defined path for our staff to be able to follow so that we could support our clients. I feel like people don't really think about that. They're like, oh my gosh, so now I have to make an entire separate container off to the side in our company, and then all of our team has to know everything about CMMC to be able
to take a vitamin. No,
that's insane. That's not possible whatsoever.
Well, and to kind of wrap her back to the tool aspect, like Kaleigh's saying, so you want to make it to where your team is just using the tools either they have experience with and you figure out a way to keep it in scope that's safe, that doesn't jeopardize the clients, or you've got to have a system to train them on how to do these new tools that they're now going to have to support the client in. And so you really have this hybrid approach. Because some of it you have to educate the team on how to do it. Some of them may not know how KQL queries or Sentinel, and some of them may not know, some of those processes that you've built inside your ticket system based on these things. And now they have to put some more notes than what they've ever had to do before.
Yes.
But, it was really great. Like in our audit, our auditor was like, because the way that we did it is just a little transparency is we have what we call our CMC list. It stands for cyber maintenance checklist. And so what that checklist does is it has a ton of activities that are happening on a weekly, monthly, quarterly, biannually, annually process. And they have unique identifiers in them. And then they're associated by the client. So we can literally do searches in our ticketing system based on those unique identifiers to know those activities. And you can just look. As soon as you search, you can just see the dates and when they're happening and everything. And then you have a specific ticket template notes that are specific to those activities so that you're making sure those happen. So when you are looking at those tools, you want to think about how can I use those tools to help me not be a boat anchor, but I want to try to do that. And so that's how we started thinking about, can we build these things because then we don't have to keep saving these in some folder. We've got them in a searchable database that when our audit would happen, the auditor would be like, okay, I see in your CMC list, this is the activity you're doing. Can you show me the one that happened most recently? We just do the search. Boom. Here we go. Here's the standard notes for the ticket activities. Here's where we validated this stuff, this, and this. And they're like, great, awesome. And you move on. And so that's where it's just, you've got to really think about those tools because they can be your boat anchor or your savior,
Yeah, that's right. And something I've talked about a bit is integrating CMMC into the business processes. And Kaleigh, great point. It goes exactly back into that because I'm a VP of cyber at a defense contractor. And so I'm running a CMMC program, getting ready to be, assessed here, but we can't stand alone. We can't just have our CMMC policies and procedures and like, great, we've got it.
And that maintenance is such a key role, like you said, because like sometimes even with clients, we have to remind them like, look, after you get your level 2 certification, you're not done. Like we have to, these processes continue to have to happen and we're in it to win it for you to do that. But, that's why that list is so nice because on the list that we have, it's not just our activities, it's also theirs. So we're able to, when we meet with them quarterly, say, okay, this quarter, here's the list of things you need to do, kind of periscope up, do your visitor logs, do this review of this,
That's great.
Go through and check your users. We're going to send you the list of them, validate they're fine. All right. You do those, you're good for this quarter. And, we'll see you next quarter.
That's awesome.
And those are the types of activities. So you need to be thinking, and you would want to expect that from your MSP. You want to see that they're thinking along those lines for those activities. Because if they don't have a list for you to do stuff, are you assuming they're doing it all? Because I can pretty much guarantee you they can't. So what is not getting done then, right?
Yeah.
Something's not getting done.
Wow. So true.
That's right. Yeah. That reminds me of RMF's continuous monitoring phase once they get the ATO. And when I was on the government side, I was there for about 5 years. Then I jumped back out into contracting. At that point, we were at the end of DIACAP, about ready to jump into RMF. I know you spoke with Dr. Ron Ross, who announced his retirement today as well.
Yeah.
But when I was able to speak with him on my podcast, he told me the story, about what was happening. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting because when I was down, working in DoD, getting ready for RMF, he was having those conversations. It was so fascinating. And the continuous monitoring aspect is really interesting. And there's some definite benefits and positives that we can take from that. The way they look at it is the control set, and they look at control volatility. Well, if it's a volatile control and will change often, then you might want to review that one more often than just once a year.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, but with that point that you're bringing up about those CMMC comments you're making throughout over time, that's evidence, as well, that all of that helps.
Exactly.
Well, and this is the challenge that we had when we were coming through. Like you have experience where you've kind of grown up and seen the evolution, and RMF is such a veteran system framework that's been around for a while, and having that kind of experience really starts opening your eyes and thoughts to risk assessments and other activities. But as an MSP where you've kind of grown into that space, like they're not thinking that. They're not teaching that. Right. They're like, okay, how do you support your clients and make them happy? And then you can make some monthly reoccurring revenue. And they're not thinking about the stuff that you're having to kind of go through. And to some extent, MSPs, their perspective are almost diametrically opposed to that, which is not healthy.
That's so true.
And so as MSPs that are trying to come into that space, they have to break those habits and start thinking about it. Like when I'm going to rat on myself a little bit, but as I was going through this journey, I was like, risk assessments, that seems dumb. I don't have to risk assess a client. I can do whatever. I'm smart. I've been in the industry for whatever. That's exactly how I talk like that with that kind of accent.
Just like that.
And so but then as I got in the system, I started seeing the beauty of it, like the importance of it, why you have to look at the risk, why you see that. And what you saw over time is like our risk assessment process for us, and as we're doing it for our clients, has been evolving and getting better. And I feel safer from a company perspective that now I'm starting to try to identify. Now we're like, let's add some more stuff. Let's look at this. Let's see how, because you start thinking about, running a business is freaking scary and hard, and there's a lot of risk. So you want to put those fears, to some extent on that list to help you start to identify what those threats are, whether it's, to your business operation, whether it's to the health and well-being of your image, whether it's to the mission of your, contracts and whether you can fulfill them, you can, do your obligations, like all of those things, you have to start thinking about it. And so many things play to that. And so putting that on there starts dropping that off of your brain and putting it on something where you can actually start working on it. And but that's, for you've probably grown up and that makes sense. That's like, passing and blocking on basic 101 for football. But a lot of MSPs, that's not where they've come from. That's not what they've thought about. Right. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges as MSPs are trying to come into space is that's not where they're coming from. And they have to come through this education process of come to Jesus CMMC and come to start really understanding of what this really means.
I think it's just an interesting perspective of coming from the MSP world and not really understanding Jacob, what you were saying of RMF. And I didn't even know that stuff really of how that works, but we just created it because it made sense, to us internally. And it's just so interesting, that perspective.
It's amazing how a wheel is a wheel from whatever perspective.
A wheel's a wheel.
Right? You're like, that's a wheel. We don't call it a wheel. We call it a widget, whatever, but it's a wheel.
But it's a wheel.
That's what fits there. And that's what needs to happen in order for that to work, because a square and a triangle don't get it done.
Hey folks, question for you. Do you know the status of your compliance controls right now? Right now? We know that real-time visibility is critical for security, but when it comes to our GRC programs, we rely on point-in-time checks. But get this, more than 8,000 companies like Atlassian and Guerra have continuous visibility into their controls with Vanta. Here's the gist. Vanta brings automation to evidence collection across 30 frameworks like SOC 2 and ISO 27001. They also centralize key workflows like policies, access reviews, and reporting, and help you get security questionnaires done 5 times faster with AI. Now that's a new way to GRC. Learn more about Vanta at vanta.com/GRC Academy. Now back to the episode. We'll talk about scoping. What are the factors involved? And then maybe talk through an example or two of what that exercise might look like in an MSP environment.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good one. What do we say, Kaleigh? There's 2 mountains, right?
Yeah, there's 2 mountains. There's the one that we're climbing internally and then one for our clients.
Right. So, and the scoping, I think, follows that. So you've got to look first about the scoping that you're going to do for you as an MSP. So you've got to think about how you have to scope for you to provide your best advantage for your clients. What are you going to self-host for them to provide to them? What are you then going to include in your scope so that you can support them out of that?
Right.
So how are you going to connect to your clients to support them? Are you going to use some mechanism that's native on their side or your side? You've got to figure that out. And then once you go through that, then you want to start thinking as a smart MSP, what you want to do is sit down and define the acceptable scope and the scenarios you'll support. Mm-hmm. And how would you do it? And then already have your policies and procedures sort of identified. Does that eliminate a chunk of clients? Yep. Mm-hmm. Does that raise your level of accuracy for the clients that you say yes to? Yep. Mm-hmm. you're starting to define that avatar of the client of what you're looking for. Now everybody's different. So it's a delicate balance of working that scope, but you need to identify the acceptable scenarios that you can support and where you can say, this is because you're doing them a favor, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to support them in a halfway. You want to be able to own that spot, square, fill that whole square in, shade it completely so that it's ready to go. And so I think in that scoping, that's the challenge, is looking at that. And then for the client, you want to scope for them based on what's appropriate cost-wise for them, how you can do that, because you don't want to bring their whole facility into scope if you can help it.
So if you can help it.
You want to think strategies for the client that can provide the best efficiency for what they're trying to do, at the same time keeping their costs to a minimum, even though none of the C's stand for cheap and CMMC, like I said before. You want to think about how you could do that. So an example of that is like, okay, is there a way that you could have all the workstations, or some of the workstations be in scope, be at the location, but not have the location in scope? Right? It's definitely doable if you scope things appropriately. You have the right security parameters and different things. So how do you do that? You need to think about that. Like, you need to already have a plan about how you can do that. Now, the client might come to you and say, well, I want to do this, 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 and this. And you're like, well, there's no way we can do what I was just thinking. The whole location is not in scope. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
People are dropping off loads of CUI out of the back of a truck on the, whatever. Like,
Oh, no.
what I mean? Like, you can't avoid that. Like, how they operate just isn't going to let you do it. But if how they operate does afford that, why wouldn't you want to capitalize on that?
Something that just came to mind is, as an MSP, you thrive on repeatability, right? And processes, as well as customer processes and all that stuff. So picking for the correct customer, as we were just mentioning previously, is really important. And as you alluded to, the truckload of paper CUI, no.
I'm sure that's a nightmare for you. Yeah.
Right. When you have a client coming to you and they're really serious about this and all that, how often is it, okay, client, you're serious about this, but unfortunately, you're going to have to rip and replace to fit into our model. How much can you change as an MSP to adopt a client's model?
I'm curious what you think about that, Kaleigh, because you're on almost, as a sales participant, like, you're almost on all those calls, and you're more, I'm curious your thought about that.
Let me preference by saying the sales process as well is not the same when doing CMMC, because you cannot have a person trying to talk to a client as your MSP that does not know anything about CMMC, because it's impossible. So I'm going to preference by saying that. Now let's talk about the sales calls. So it's difficult, because I do preference in saying we have spent a tremendous amount of time on our templates. And we have now, officially now, gone through a CMMC Level 2 assessment with our SSP, which your template SSP that we will give you talks back to. So knowing that should give you a lot of confidence. But because of that, you have to be very careful on what you're able to and not able to change in your SSP that we're about to give you, because of how much it talks back to ours. And, I do really emphasize that to our potential clients because of two reasons. One, you're not going to just get to do whatever you want willy-nilly. And I think there is a positive to that as well. And two, because we spent so much time to make you feel like so confident in what you're going to get. And the more that you change it, the less confident you can be. So I do feel like when I explain it in that way, a lot of clients would rather just, like, if they don't have too much, start anew with that. Because of the confidence that it does bring. Now, obviously, depending on the client, depending on the scenario, there can be situations where you can add something in very easily and it's not going to completely change everything. But that's just the perspective that I've seen so far. Bobby, what would you say in your perspective?
Yeah, I'm trying to think, like, if I could give you a percentage just to really boil it down to a simple answer. And I would say probably most clients that we have that come to us at least have to chunk a good piece of things. They might, for example, like what Kaleigh's saying is we say, okay, you have policies, you might even have an SSP. Okay, cool. Let me show you what you're going to get on the template and how it works for us. And then as you like show, they're like,
never mind.
Yeah, we're going to chunk ours. We're going to go with what
they
you
say
got.
never mind. Yeah.
Can you just adjust it to kind of more of this kind of stuff? And we're like, yeah, we can do that. And they're like, that sounds great.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Sign me up for more of that, please. So usually policy and procedure wise, they're just excited to have something that has all the required linkage because part of the reason why you're there is they've gotten so frustrated in that process. They've sort of just thrown their hands up in it in general.
Yeah.
But then we run into, I would say, half of the clients will have something built already. And what I mean by half is like they'll said, well, I heard from a friend of a friend that I need GCC or GCCI and I already got it. Right. And so it's nice that they have it. But to me, that's actually more complicated to set up because especially if they're fully in it, because most everybody that I work with, when I go to come in to look at it, they're using tools that aren't appropriate to connect to those resources. They don't have the GPOs configured, or not GPOs, but let's just pretend they're using Intra and Intune.
Sure.
Like they don't have things configured the right way in such a way that's going to accommodate for efficient and easy way of, and let's say that maybe the way they're doing it works great for them, but it's not our system that we have. So we still have to then now create DCA policies that have the right names that call back to the policies that we have, that have our validation scripts when we go in to check, this is where we're going to go. So you've got to go through and sort of build all that back out, even if they have it in a compliant way, because the policies and the procedures are all kind of calling back to those things. I just don't see a way that you could do that to where you're not going to have to just rewrite chunks. And we've got a process where we go through, we split it into like, there are global settings that you have to set that they're going to feel and you can't like stage it. But then like CA policies, for example, or configuration policies, you can build those and then turn them into like monitor mode. So you have some options there. So we kind of split those type of stage changes of those things that are going to be global that you have to just turn on. You just stage them at a certain time, communicate with the client, and then you go to do it. But then the other items, you can apply them, put in one or two machines, validate how things are working, then roll it out over time. And so those are more friendly or nicer to do that. And then at the end, everything is the way that it's supposed to be in alignment with the policies and templates that we have, and they go about their business.
It's almost as if we're to NIST 800-171 revision 3 with the ODPs. And if you're not careful, your customers could create a bunch of variables for you. So
and we did that. So in our templates, we actually have, and we call them ODVs. We actually have ODVs in preparation for that. And we have them built out so that we wanted, as we had discussions, we have a sheet that we go through and say, here are the organizational defined values that we know that you're going to probably want to change. Lockout timer, right? What is your naming convention for accounts, workstations? Like, people have preferences about how that is. So those are all organizational defined values that we have. And then we just go through with them and start to fill those out. So right off the bat, they have a lot of configuration and input on what that is. And we kind of go through and go through those ODVs with them. But we see that that's just so many, there's interesting possibilities there where we can even get better at that. So we're just really trying to drill down in that even more.
Well, let's talk about the resources involved with becoming an MSP that's CMMC Level 2 certified. Obviously, there's cost, there's people involved, there's technology. How much did you allocate for CMMC? And then also from start to finish, if it's cut and dry, how long did it take as well?
Yeah, I think, Kaleigh, so we like 4 years, I guess, when we started talking with you. So it sneaks up on you. It is super dangerous when you go to get into CMMC, how sinister it can be about pulling money from different weird places that you're not expecting. So you have to be really careful about that. We earmarked $250,000. We kind of set it in the bank and said, okay, I hope I don't, pull from this. As the organization is moving, an MSP should healthily. I think the statistic is In most peer groups, they say that an MSP should have 13% EBITDA or higher, right? They want to see somewhere 20, but somewhere around that you want to have. So the organization should be healthy and making money. But when you go to step into a situation where you're going into a new market, there's going to be a lot of cost, and CMMC is no exception. It is the rule and then some. So you're going to start, it is like the Hoover that is going to start sucking money out of your wallet as you're trying to go down there.
Right.
And here are some things that you got to do. Like, we had whole marketing plans and strategies that we were thinking about as a traditional MSP we're going to do. We threw all of that out. So Kaleigh then had to go on a whole, vision quest journey to start spending her time, which I'm sure you could spend an hour talking about that, Kaleigh, about like how to do the grassroots program. Who do we need to talk to? What are the communications we need to do? What are the relationships? Who are the people? And it's not just self-serving. It's a tight-knit community that you need to step in there and start providing. Like, you're not just there to show up like a baby bird. You've got to be a contributor to the community and try to help out. What does that look like? So that was just one huge challenge for her to go under. And then for me, it's like, what does our organization just look like as this phoenix that has transformed out of the ashes? Like, what does that look like? Not that we were in ashes before we went into CMMC, but like, you get the idea of like, it's transformative. Like, you have to come change as an organization. And what does that look like? There wasn't a peer group for me to turn to. So I had to get consultants and talk with them, but they didn't have all the pictures. They weren't MSPs either. They knew some of the pieces. So it was, this is where like I say, that cost can be so sinister, is it's just meeting with so many different people to try to get little bit. It's kind of like painting with numbers. You don't have the whole thing painted in. So you've got to, what are the required licenses? What's the difference between GCC and GCC high? What can and can't do? What can you promise the client? What you can't promise in the client in these different infrastructures? And trust me, there's some significant differences between those, and the list just goes on and on and on and on. And if you don't have the knowledge, how do you get it? Most of the time, it's going to require some type of money, whether it's time spent figuring it out, or whether it's time spent sitting in a classroom that you had to pay the money. So now you're doing twice. The CCP is just an example of that. And then, I'll never forget, I was at CS2 Denver, which I was, the irony is dipped here. Like, I'm at a competitor, Summit 7, friends of mine, love those guys to death. I'm at, they were nice enough to let me come, and I was learning about just different things. And when I was there, I was like, you know what? There's no way in heck I'm going to do this on my own. Just me, one person. I need to have someone else that understands documentation and design of those pieces, because documentation design is just as complicated and important as infrastructure design. So, and for CMMC, as I was looking through that, I'm like, it is almost identical as far as in complexity. Like, you've got like those suckers spiderweb out from your SSP, and you've got to get it nailed down. So I'm like, there's no way I'm going to have time to do both in any reasonable time frame. So I was like, I got to bring on Adam. So I talked with him, and he's like, that sounds exciting. Sign me up for that. And so he came on board, and then we immediately deleted all of our documentation and started over. And so that journey of starting was just me and Adam over the course of 8 months. And we went through, and it took us 8 months to build our GCC high tenant from scratch. And we what we did is we sat down and we went to Kiri and we bought the templates from her, but they were based on just a small MSP with one person, not MSP.
A small SMB.
Like a small SMB doing just like one thing, right? That one dude or person is doing these tasks. And we're like, well, that's great. That gives us an idea of what right looks like in this scenario, but we need to extrapolate it to what it looks like for an MSP that has scale. And so, Adam sort of just put it on a petri dish and started growing it out, to try to make this thing work for what we needed. And then I'm over here just like hacking in the woods, trying to figure out how to get this design for what we're doing. And there was just nobody to turn to that said, oh, for an MSP, that's what you need. And so we had to just figure it out on our own. And then after we thought we had it figured out, we were like, but is it right? Right? It's my baby. Of course, it's beautiful and it has the best voice in the world, and it can sing and it can solve all the world's problems.
That's what you said about me.
Yeah, right. And in that case, it happens to be true, but not everybody is that fortunate as I am. And so, that's not the case. So you've got to have other people that aren't in your echo chamber to look at it and kick the tires. And so we had multiple consultants, which they don't do that for free.
Right.
Look at those things, and then just as you start to see, I mean, Adam, all he did was our CMMC journey. That is it when he came on board. So, he's been with us for over a year, so that is one dedicated salary for him, a huge chunk of my time, tons of money for education,
the templates,
consulting, wrong decisions that cost you money that you have to go back and correct, later on. Then you've got the audit. We did a mock audit, so, those are not cheap. So those are different organizations on their size. I've seen some people get as low as 15 and some in the 30s or 40s for audits for our size, K, that is. And for mock audits, because you're not having as many people, you can typically get it for less. And you can even engage with a CPO and say, hey, look, how about you audit 5 or 6 of our domains, right? And they can look at some pieces so you don't have to go through all of it. So there's different wisdom that you can kind of go through to save some of the cost, but you're gonna pony up if you want to be able to do it right. And it's not going to be quick unless you just throw a lot of people at it. Well, more people, more money.
More money.
So that, finding that balance is super hard. So that's why after I went through the audit, I kind of sat down and I said to myself, I'm like, how many MSPs can do this? Like, this was crazy hard.
Yeah.
The journey of learning how to navigate that, the cost of time to do it, like, there's 16 of us. And, we were able to, over the time, build through that appropriate management funds of our company to build a war chest that when we wanted to go after something, we had the money to be able to allocate toward it. But not every MSP can do that. So that's a huge challenge for anybody that wants to come in the space to try to do it right. But you see people that are trying to do it wrong because they don't want to have to do it right, because if they had to do it right, they realize they couldn't do it. That's
a good word.
I'm not trying to sound self-serving here, but at least that's the truth, the way I see it.
When you're talking about 250K, that number you gave earlier, are you talking about the costs to go all in on this? Or are you looking at it, well, we're already using systems and that's not going to be included in this cost? I'm trying to understand the cost a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah. So the way that you want to look at it is you want to think about how fast do you want to get this done? So for me, in my opinion, I wanted to get us ready in a year, and I wanted to be able to move clients through in the next year. So what does that mean? So let's pretend that in the first year you have bought the space and now you're building it out, right? But you're paying rent on that space. You've already got the lease and whether you have clients coming in does not matter. You're paying for that space. So as you define that you're starting, you need to think about what type of resources you're going to get. So for me, I got Adam, right? So now that clock is ticking, that's the first rent that I'm paying. There is, I have a resource that is going to consume monies from the business, but he needs to work in something. So now I've got to buy a tenant, right? So now that's Microsoft licenses that are churning, right? But we don't necessarily have the knowledge. So now I got to get an education perhaps on some of these things. So now I got to get consultants. Well, who am I going to get? So now I need to find people that have done this, at least the consulting, that can tell us whether we're doing things right or backwards. So now what do you want to do? You want to pick a C3PO, somebody that's gone through JSV assessments, that knows what the heck they're doing and have actually done it. So now you're going to spend time with highly qualified people that do not charge cheap hourly rates. So now you're spending time sitting with them while you're paying another person solely to get ready for, it just keeps adding up. And so, luckily what happened is as the company was still profitable, we're able to consume some of those profits to go through. So we're not having to dump into that 250 off the K, but you're spending it through your natural profits that are coming in. We just put that 250 aside as a reserve that if things went terribly wrong and we had to dip in, we could grab it if we needed to keep things operating the way that we wanted to on those processes. That is not what I would say is the best operating process if you want to have to me, that was the way I wanted to do it. You know, I don't know if you went to, you know, Harvard Business School, if they would probably agree with that approach, but, you know, that's what made sense to me. So I allocated the funds to do it as kind of like the backup if things weren't going as well that we could pull from. But, you know, when you think about the fact that now that we've finished our year and we're moving into our clients, now we're starting to get new, because we weren't we weren't advertising to bring on any clients until we were ready to support them. So you have to think about it like you have the space that you're building out. And this is where I think a lot of times MSPs go horribly wrong is they're like, well, we need to try to compensate for the cost. Let's bring clients in now. And you're like, you don't even have a booth to sit people down to feed them food. You've got the space. You know, what are you going to take up? Yeah. You know,
you're literally building the table and they're trying to eat on it.
Muck it over with that we were painting on just, 15 minutes ago.
It over.
Right. Yeah. Just like sit here and I'll feed you. And
hold on one second. Can you lift the plates up real quick?
Yeah. Like it just doesn't work. So we knew that. So we were like, we're not going to have any clients during this process. That's another reason why we had to move quickly is we wanted to move as urgently as we could through the process to get to client ready. And so that was our mock assessment in August. So we had to go through. So that's where you get the 8 months because we were assessment ready in August and we got assessed. Then we got our perfect 110 in our mock assessment. But let me tell you, that prepared us some, but it was not, our real audit, you had 2 CCAs, a quality assurance person. They were bringing it. It was a lot harder from the mock versus the real heat that they were bringing in the audit. But, all of that, then you have the Microsoft licenses, and then we have to, we talked about it before with agreements, right? My agreements didn't naturally speak to 32 CFR and the 48 that's coming and any of the DFARs and those things. So we had to go to an attorney. We had to talk to them to get those things addressed. And we're working on that, getting that finished now. And so all of those things just add up lots of dollar values that are just chunking away.
Right.
So, but if you notice, those weren't one big capital check I had to spend. It's just all of these cuts that are coming. But if you haven't set aside the fact that you're going to start getting hit from these different directions, you could find yourself out of money and upside down and really in a lot of bad trouble if you try to do this without at least earmarking appropriately to start.
Got it. So does Axiom have a commercial side and then a CMMC side?
Yeah. So it's funny you say that. So, like before our August audit, me and Adam sat down and he said something and I was like, dang, you're right. He was like, we just built a new company, right? From scratch. Yeah. I'm like, yeah, you're right. Because that is so true. Like we have our commercial side, but we had to build a whole system, the policies and procedures, how our team are going to operate, new ways that they're going to connect to the clients. All of that was new. And then we had to think about the math of it, right? There's a saying that if you're not making money selling 10 watermelons, so if you decide, let me sell 50 or 100, right? The more watermelons you're selling, but if you don't know if you're making money, all you're doing is going out of business faster. So it's about tracking the profitability of what you're doing. Doing something more in volume does not guarantee profitability. It just means you're doing more of something either positively or negatively. So we had to, at the same time as we're doing that, I had to put the CEO hat back on and think, okay, how can we track the profitability of these activities we're doing as we bring on new clients? How are we going to track that? We're estimating this time frame, we're estimating these costs and these types of things, but we have to tell the clients, here's what the cost is going to be, and we have to make sure that we're tracking that profitability. What are the mechanisms for us to do that? We were able to lean on our experience in our commercial side, but this was all new math that we're having to figure out. There's no peer group book that you can go to, to understand that. This is all newer things that they're having to evolve based on the compliance stuff. So it's very fascinating and challenging at the same time.
We talked about agreements, right? In the customer responsibility matrix, you have what you're going to address, but then there's the contractual part between you and your client. How is that different from a commercial agreement to a agreement for a defense contractor?
there are some immediate challenges, right? You've got the DFARs that are going to have the C through G clause and requirements along those lines. You've got the whole, I don't know, you might have heard of them, the 800, 171, 171A requirements. Then you have 32 CFR that's dropping, and 48, which is going to come out final, sometime this year. So you've got to have an agreement that is going to speak through appropriately how you're going to engage your client and what you're going to be responsible for. And it has to be based off your matrix. The matrix in your agreement have to speak in that. That's why it's in the scoping guide. And it makes sense, right? Because the Department of Defense says, hey, I'm going to sign this contract to this company. They have agreed to take on this responsibility, and anyone downstream is going to have to do the same. And the MSP that's going to work on that is no different. And they want to know that they have an agreement that's appropriate to move that forward, that is going to carry that down to them. And so you want to see that inheritance process appropriately being displayed in the agreement that the MSP is going to sign with the client. And that's not talked about very often or at all that I'm aware of from most people in the industry. They're just kind of assuming that you're going to do it the right way. But I think it should be spoken out, especially for MSPs that are coming in the space, because they may not have grown up and they're not thinking about that. They're thinking about, here's a potential client, the agreement I have should work and everything should be fine. But you've got situations like, like we touched on this a little bit, but like, what if the client doesn't do what they're supposed to do? And that clearly as you're starting to work with them, they're not. And so now you're going into a dead end road that they're eventually going to be very frustrated with you because you didn't solve their problem, but they aren't actually interested in doing what's required to make them pass. So now you've just got this really bad situation that is starting to boil and eventually come to a head.
Yeah.
You want to have it in your agreement. It kind of speak to where, like, what if the MSP wasn't doing their job and the client saw that there was no way that they were going to possibly pass with their engagement with them. So the coin is, it's on both sides. So they need to think about, as the OSC, when you're engaging with that MSP, like, what kind of agreements do I have that I can get out of this if you're not doing your job? And then what does the unwind look like? Because I saw, like I said before, is in a CMMC engagement, it's very intimate from the perspective of you are so close working together on this that unwinding those, even 32 CFR has some language in there that could be interpreted that if you left your MSP, you might have to get reassessed.
Yes.
Because of the fact that you're so tightly integrated with them, if they exit stage right, are you going to find the perfect, match that's going to fill the hole that they just left? Probably not.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you start looking at that, these agreements create some very unique challenges that should absolutely be looked at. And a lot of times I think people overlook them.
That's all very interesting, especially the DFARS 7012 C through G, the incident reporting requirement. Often everybody thinks about that when it comes to a cloud service provider. But if your MSP is administrating those clouds on your behalf, I mean, it all flows through. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So but what's their obligation to report to you if they have a breach?
Yeah.
I mean, they have access to your system. Did the threat actor have access to your system? I mean, you've had some people on your podcast that talked about that. I absolutely love that person. I can't remember her name, but man, she really was like, man, I really loved what she had to say. It was like so challenging. And as an MSP myself, I was like, boy, preach it, sister. That was really great. Because as if you're an MSP and you're engaged in CMMC, like that is a really big deal if you have an incident and how you got to report it. So do they have a medium assurance certificate? Are they prepared to report for themselves if they have an incident? What are they going to tell you about what happened to them? Everybody's friends until you're not, right? When things get legal, that's when things get weird. So you need to have the language to kind of outline how that's going to go.
Hey folks, you may not know this, but I'm also leading a CMMC compliance program at a defense contractor. There's a lot involved with CMMC, and I understand how it can feel overwhelming. I was there myself many years ago, but since then, I've created CMMC training focused on defense contractors. The training covers everything from DFARS contractual clauses to to NIST 800-171A, and of course, CMMC. It's received over 100 5-star reviews and is certainly worth checking out. Find it at grcacademy.io. Now back to the episode.
All right. So it's been, you said, 4 years working toward this.
Yeah.
Tell us about the experience actually going through the CMMC certification assessment. What was that like, and any lessons learned from it?
Yeah, it was very surreal from the perspective of, we did it last month. So that was January. For our C3PO, we were the first CMMC assessment that our C3PO had done because, they'd done JSVAs, but we were the first CMMC natural audit that they were going to do. They had done that January. So we're all figuring this out. They're figuring it out. We're figuring it out as they're going through it. And it creates this unique challenge, and you sort of need to give each other a little bit of grace about how everybody's sort of finding their lanes, especially when we went into the first day, just trying to find the normal cadence of how we are going to explain our parts about our tests and our we went through our self-assessment. We had our practice tests already written out. So it was written out in such detail, an auditor could really read it and go, if what they're saying is true, that seems pretty much a met. And so we went to that detail when we did it, but we kind of had to get that cadence of they're needing us to talk to what they want to hear and making sure that we're providing that at the right time, that they're ready to receive it and hear it, and just finding that cadence as we're going through. And that first day was a little challenging for us to kind of find that naturally with them, because you've got now 2 auditors, then you have your quality assurance person that might or may not be there during that process. And so all of that is sort of shaken out at that same time. And so it was just sort of challenging that first day as we were going through getting a better definition of that process. But then in the second and third day that we went through to do that, everybody sort of found their cadence, and it planed out better. But it is something that you need to experience. And if you're an MSP supporting your clients, you want to, the more experience in that, the better, because the better chance you have of helping your clients succeed. Because going through audits and understanding that game process of how it goes, and I guess there's a better term for it, but we'll just call it game for now. But it's just how you work through that. There's a certain cadence. Everybody has to be in certain, we're talking about this now we're going to go to this. And so you've got to know that. And then you got to know, if they push back, what's going to be your response? What's the appropriate response? How do you, if they say, well, I think this is, I'm having some difficulties understanding and getting there. What are some additional evidences that you do? So it makes you have to learn the system that you're working in well enough that as they're sort of pushing back on things, trying to have better understanding, you've got to be ready to pull stuff out of your pocket and start talking about it. There were times where the auditor came at me with a question and I was like, and then at the moment, Adam will swoop in and say, well, this, and we can go to this policy and here, this speaks to this. And they're like, okay. And you're like, cool. And you're like, oh, wow, that was great. But I did the same thing for Adam sometimes when he was talking, so having that person in there to kind of help step in when you have a little bit of that pause, auditors are looking at you and they're like, help me get there. I'm ready to believe you, but you've got to tell me what I need to, what I need to feel comfortable with.
About 2 years ago, we decided that, we're going to go for ISO 9001, 20,000 TAC 1, and 27,001. And during that audit process, exactly what you're saying, we had a team in the room. When I couldn't think of the right things to say, somebody else jumped in. It was so helpful. If it's just a one person show on your side, very, very difficult, because it is the process of going through that. And let's just say it's a 6 to 8 hour day of just questions. If you're not able to answer, the assessor or the auditor really is going to, that might bring questions in their mind. I'm not really feeling certain on this control. So maybe I need to dig further on other controls. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
And that was a real fear for us. So we wanted to be as best we can, setting the narrative to our advantage. So we wanted to be prepared to have the discussions and set the tone of like, okay, you're saying this, here's this, this, and this. Now we're going to prove it. Like, let's go ahead and jump in versus them go, well, I want you to do whatever. Like, but if you can go ahead and show what they're wanting and you got them there with what you're prepared to show, well, that's great. Check. Then you're moving on to the next assessment.
Yes. Exactly. If you can make them happy right off the bat, that's ideal. Because otherwise, the deeper people go, then subjectivity can come in.
Oh, for sure.
And that can be dangerous.
And we saw that in our audit. There were a few times where we didn't have stuff written in such a way that they were able to get it right away. And then the wheels started turning. And then we started seeing other things. That's where making sure that you have written your system security plan and processes in a way and so that they can get there quickly is critical, because what you're saying is so true, Jacob. You don't want that dwell time any longer than it has to be, because then they start thinking about what ifs and about this. And, now that I think about it, and then the other one chimes in and says, yeah, you're right. And then you're just like, oh no, this is not going well. But another thing that was nice that I got to see is, as I was starting this journey, and I don't know, I'm curious what your opinion is about this too, Jacob, is as I saw the ecosystem starting to go from like this cloud to something like solid, like Jello, to then start to become, something more hard, and then actually becoming, something metal of substance. And then 32 CFR came out, and boom, now we're cooking. When I first started coming to this, I was like, are we gonna have to be perfect? Like, based on the way that I'm seeing the DODAM scoring system, if I miss a phrasing and don't have things aligned. Like, for example, in ours, we got a temporary not met for us because we had a mismatch in policy around password changing processes. Obviously our system was very mature and it worked, but we're human. And so we didn't have it right. And my fear when we were first starting off is like, is that immediate fail? Like, are we done at that point? Because that's a 3-point control. And now, see you next month. And we're going to go back through this whole audit again. I'm just like, oh my gosh, like, is that what this is going to be like? I had real fear that if you weren't perfect, it was immediate F, and you're just see you at the back of the line. And when you get back up here again, we'll reschedule for the assessment. I was like, man, this is going to be crazy rough. And I was great to see that when we came in the audit, they were like, look, if you have some not mets, we'll put it up here. We're going to go through. And at the end of it, feel free to continue to provide additional evidence and other things, adjusting policies and other things, following your processes and change control if necessary is appropriate. Those were fine for us to do that during the audit. And we were able to, within 20 minutes, address those things, get it in alignment, flip that from not met, trending not met to met. And we were, human, but back on track again. Just that's going to happen for organizations. And it was nice to see that also they included the 10-day period in there, right? So, you can adjust things during that. And then you have the 32 CFR had the 10-day period that you can reevaluate not met controls. And it doesn't have a stipulation that it has to be only 1-pointers. As I started to see it in an actually working process, I was like, okay, if the organization really was prepared and they were really serious about doing this and they respected the process and they came in and a human factor kicked in, they'll still pass, which was really a fear for me. And they had some processes, which after I went through it and kind of thought through it and they explained it a little bit more, it made more sense is they were like, well, we're not going to reevaluate immediately. You resubmit it. Like we're going to do that on the day that we have that we aren't talking with you. So we had 4 days allocated. And I was like, why are you in 4 days? Well, the way that they did it, and not everybody has to do it this way, is they did half days with us. So the other part, they had time for them to talk if they wanted to through things. It was 4 days of the audit, but it was only half days for us in general.
Okay.
And then because we were very prepared for what's going on, they weren't even full half days, because typically we finished an hour or two early because they were kind of going through the controls quicker because we tended to be more prepared. They did do some interesting combinings. They didn't go top down like some people do. So they followed kind of the recommendations of the combining. So they did like AC and AU. So auditing access control, all of those are just kind of working together. That was a really tough one to go through because it's so technical and how their stuff is logging together and how it's communicating. So that was probably the hardest day. But then that was the day that we had the not met because they discovered some of those mismatches in the policy that we had to go through. And so like I was mad. I was mad at myself. I was mad that happened. I'm just like, I was really frustrated. But I knew going in, they had explained, more about our ability to reevaluate and resubmit stuff and make changes. And so I was glad to see that. So we did that, but then they weren't able to tell us their answer until the 5th day. So, you're like, oh, so I got to wait till the 5th day. I knew that it was fine that what we changed was going to flip it to met, but it still makes you uncomfortable.
It's like a 5-day certification exam.
Yeah, right. And it's like, you've been working on this for 3 years, and it's just like, you're scared it might be slipping out of your fingers. So that fear monger wants to get in there and start playing with your head some.
So they weren't telling you this control is met, this control is not met. It was, you find out at the end of the day.
It's kind of like this car wash at the end at each day. So, each controls you have, they're going to tell you, okay, we found nothing not met. So you're trending met on everything so far. And then anything that does fall into the not met becomes in this list that they carry forward at the end of kind of that car wash closeout each day.
Gotcha.
And they kind of go through it. So we had 4 closeout sessions where they would talk and they would say, okay, everything was met. And then on the second day, there was some things they found so then they carried it in the 3rd day and the 4th day. So you get to look at those every day and you're like, oh, and you're like, I think all the changes that we did should have addressed those. And on that Friday, they're like, yep, everything's great. You guys had a great system. These were just very minuscule things that we did. But based on what we saw, we had to mark them not met. You quickly adjusted it. Everything's great. We're super happy. Yeah. And that made us feel great because it was a lot of work and effort. But it was good to see the human factor being accounted for.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So yes, without a doubt. So right off the bat, I'm hearing SSP was documented at the assessment objective level. That's amazing. That gave them the ability to almost, and probably in many cases, just look at it and understand it and maybe ask some additional questions, additional evidence, all those things. So that's awesome. Hearing that you had a team, with you to help you fill in that answer when it's not coming to you. That's great too. So what was maybe a lesson learned? Because those were things that went well and that you were glad that, you did. What were some lessons learned and maybe things that you might have changed going into this?
Ooh, that's a good one. Now that I see that if you're really prepared, that you don't necessarily have to run yourself totally ragged if you're really prepared to try to make sure that, maybe checking that document 3 times is enough versus 6. you know what I mean? Because, and let me just give you an example. Like we reviewed all of our policies at least 4 times for just various grammatical purpose checks, of which dates and time stamps and signatures on things, although they're not technically required, the signature isn't. We still have it on the policies that we do, but that's our process. And so if that's the rules you play by, then, and you define it that way, then the auditors are going to be like, well, that's your rule. You've got to play by that. So, but that's made sense to us and that's why we did it. But on like day 1 of our mock, this is in August, the auditor, the first policy he brings up, he looks at the date and goes, well, that's wrong. And you're just like, 4 people looked at, and within like a minute, he saw a date wrong. And we all looked at it, but it was the wrong year. It was the right date, but it was the wrong year. And we just slipped up on that basic thing. Now, we didn't make any of those same mistakes come time for the audit. So I guess one of the lessons I would learn is make sure that you have your self-assessment document that go through and account for the assessment objective statements you're going to say. Write it out about how you're going to do it. And then write out how you're going to do your validation testing. So if they ask about 311 alpha, what does that look like? Be prepared to show a folder where you have the access forms. Be prepared, already know what you're going to say written out. And then if you need to, if you're not feeling comfortable, just read it or whatever and be ready to go. So that would be a lesson of making sure, and we learned that in our mock. We moved that forward. But we were just so worried about the human factor. We weren't sure how much grace would be given during the actual audit. And that made us, I think, over prepare. It made me stress more than I needed to. We were very prepared when we came in. And it was almost bad from the perspective of you have your phase 1, and we had almost a month between phase 1 or phase 2. So you had this like pause between. So like we got ramped up for phase 1 and then nothing. And you're like just rechecking your answers between phase 1 and phase 2. And it really drove me nuts. We were double checking things to be ready for the phase 2. And it, looking back at that, we probably could have chilled out more and just relaxed a little bit because it didn't make any difference. We were just as prepared. And
so you're saying when you checked it on Christmas Eve with me that was not needed?
Yeah, that was probably not needed. That would be correct. Yeah, I just, I think being that way. And then I think the other lesson learned is making sure that you understand the process even better than the auditor and how the assessment process goes. Mm-hmm. So just making sure that in that time frame, what is your rights? What is your ability? How does that go? Making sure, because there's some stuff we learned through that, and it wasn't anything bad. It was just educational. But I think for some people, if they weren't prepared, it could be.
The CMMC assessment process is out there. I mean, it's publicly available. So that's a great point. Anyone getting ready for their assessment, read that thing, know what to expect.
Well, it's not just reading it and being able to like verbate it for a Jeopardy. It's like, what does it look like? Does that make sense? Like, it's one thing to understand what the rule says. It's another to visualize what that process truly looks like. I can read the rule book of what a baseball game or a football game looks like, but then visualizing it really being played out in reality can be different than what you're seeing. So just going through, looking at it and knowing the general processes, but then thinking about what does that look like in real life can be a little bit different. And that's one of the things that kind of popped me in the face a little bit is I wasn't sure how all that was going to play out in the real scenario. And that was a great lesson learned.
Well, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for coming on, both of you, and sharing all of your knowledge and experience. I really appreciate it. Where can folks find you?
We're going to be at Seek West, so you can definitely find us there. We're going to have a booth and table. You can hit me on LinkedIn as well as Kaleigh. She's very active on that. Axiom.tech is our webpage. We have our podcast, Climbing Mount CMMC, which Kaleigh is the producer and co-hosts with me.
Well, I'll put all those links in the description. Thank you so much again for your time. Really enjoyed getting to talk with you again. Thank you.
Yeah, our pleasure.
Thanks, Jacob.
Hey, folks. Hope you enjoyed that. If you want to see more, be sure to subscribe and then check out this video.